today I'm going to talk about, as Daniel mentioned, I'm going to go into the details of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, the negotiations, what the core issues, so the four core issues that are borders, Jerusalem, security, and refugees, and how to deal with those. And as Daniel mentioned, obviously those are not the only issues that they've discussed over the past 20 years since the beginning of the Oslo Peace Accords in 1993. They've discussed other kinds of issues like water and other kinds of things, but at the end of the day, you can put most of the main issues in these core. And I want to make sure that at the end of this talk today that you understand what are the obstacles? What's the position of the Israelis? What's the position of the Palestinians on each one of these core issues? Why does it matter to them? And what are the gaps that still remain? Now, I'm only going to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian talks. I'm not going to discuss the larger Arab-Israeli talks. I can discuss some of those with you during the negotiation, during the question section, because there's also a lot of misconceptions about that. And those type of talks between Arab states and Israel have been going on since 1949. And a lot of people don't know that. But today I'm going to talk about these four core issues and I'll go through each one. Also, if you have any, there's going to be a lot of maps. I'm going to go into some detail. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand and ask it as soon as you have the question, because it's better for me to try to answer your question early as opposed to later on, because you might then not understand material that goes that I mentioned later on. Okay, so the first thing are borders. And so the borders issue really comes down to the creation of Israeli settlements. And that has become the biggest obstacle. And here you see a map that outlines, this is the West Bank. It outlines all of the settlements that Israel created up until 1982. There's been additional settlements that have been created since then, especially what are known as outposts, which even the Israeli government considers illegal, which I'll talk about later. But at least these are settlements, and you can see how they're scattered all over the land. And so when we talk about borders, what we're talking about is how to establish the borders of future Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And then to finalize, if you will, the Israeli internationally recognized borders. And so, what are the key issues here? So for the parties on these different issues. So on the Israeli side, what they want is they want to be able to annex as many settlers as possible. So they, in all of the plans that they've proposed in negotiations, they want to annex at least 90% of the settler population, in the West Bank, and about 99.99% of the settler population in East Jerusalem. There's only about a few buildings that they would evacuate in East Jerusalem, and I'll show you some of those in a second. For Palestinians, they argue that they've already made their historic compromise, because when we talk about borders, we're talking about the 1967 war. There's been a lot of wars in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Two of the most important ones are the 1948 war, which established the state of Israel and also created the Palestinian refugee problem, which I'll talk about in a second. So that's the 1948 war. But when we're talking about borders, we're talking about the 1967 war, when Israel, after a war with its neighbors, with Egypt, Syria, Jordan, occupied a lot of territory, including the West Bank and Gaza, and the Golan Heights and the Sinai, which are issues to deal with Syria and issues that got taken care of with Egypt in 1979. But it created what is known as the occupation of Gaza, which we don't see here, and then the occupation of the West Bank, which is what you see here. And as soon as Israel controlled that territory, it started building settlements. First and immediately in East Jerusalem, and Israelis don't consider settlements in East Jerusalem to be settlements. They just call them neighborhoods. The international community considers them to be settlements and against violations of the Fourth Geneva Conventions and so on and so forth. But for the first 10 years, for the first decade, just in the West Bank, Israel was under the Labor government, and they only, so from 1967 to 1977, in this West Bank, there were only about 5,000 settlers. And most of the settlers were in the Jordan Valley, in this area, what they called security settlements. So they started creating these settlements here in case there would be an invading army that would come from Jordan, and they serve as a buffer. So that was labor. And there were other settlements that they also created that I can get into, but for the most part, it was only 5,000 settlers. Then, in the elections in the late 70s, when Likud came to power, Likud is the current party of Benjamin Netanyahu, it created this massive settlement expansion where they created over 100 settlements. And that's where really you get, and settlements all over the place. And a lot of very strategically placed settlements adjacent to major Palestinian cities to limit the growth of Palestinian cities. So there was a strategic component to where they were putting some of these settlements as well under Likud. And so this creates a big problem because now you have a lot of people. Today, you have just in the West Bank 300,000 settlers. And in East Jerusalem, you have an additional 200,000. And so what the negotiators are trying to figure out is, from the Israeli perspective, is they want to make sure that they have to evacuate the least amount number of Israeli settlers from their homes. And from a Palestinian perspective is they want to make sure, first they say, we already agreed to a historic compromise. When in the Oslo agreements, they recognized the state of Israel, recognizing it based on the June 4th, 1967 borders. And they say, we already made our historic compromise. We already gave up our historic home, if you will, our ancient home. So Israel proper, right? That's for Palestinians, that used to be their home. And so we're from all of Israel and Palestine of today, of the 100% of the territory, Palestinians will always remind you, we've already done our historic compromise. We're willing to settle for the remaining 22% of our historic land, meaning the West Bank and Gaza. So that's always their starting point. But in addition to that, negotiations with Palestinians have been willing to do that, say, Egyptians were not willing to do when they negotiated with Israel, or Syrians were not willing to do when they negotiated with Israel, or Jordanians, is that they're willing to accept Israel annexing certain parts of the West Bank in order to, accommodate some of Israel's, domestic political concerns of not having to evacuate too many Israeli settlers. And what they've come up with, what the Palestinians introduced in the Camp David talk, actually right before that, was the concept of land swaps, which Israelis and Americans at the beginning were not very open to, but have grown to accept this notion of land swaps. And so the idea of land swaps then is, okay, so Palestinians would say, fine, we're going to let you annex Molin Elite, right? A very huge settlement of about 40,000 to 50,000 Palestinians that's right adjacent to the border. But for every kilometer that we let you annex, you give us a kilometer back in return, and it has to be of equal quality land, right? So if we give you very good quality land where you can grow olives, you're not going to give us desert land in return. And so that has also been a challenge and a sticking point as well. So those are the major points in terms of borders. Then we get to East Jerusalem. And East Jerusalem, of course, is also an issue of borders, because you're dividing East Jerusalem, which Israel right now controls. But it gets a little bit more complicated because it's probably some of the most valuable real estate in the world because of all the very important holy sites for Jews, Muslims, and Christians, which I'll show you in a second. So here's East Jerusalem. And so Israel occupies this in 1967. And as you can see on all the little white dots, those are Israeli settlements, or what Israelis would call Israeli neighborhoods, because they annexed this part of the land in 1982. And so you get, you've now created 200,000 additional settlers in that area. Now the most contentious issue, settlement here, is really Har Homa, here at the bottom. Har Homa is important because it cuts off Bethlehem from East Jerusalem, but Har Homa also has this very important symbolic, there's a symbolic significance to it, because it was created in 1997 under the first term of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And so for Palestinians, 1997, the Oslo Peace Accords already had been going on for 4 years. And Netanyahu comes in and creates a settlement in the most contentious area that you could imagine. And so the Palestinians, when they're in negotiations, they agree that Israelis can annex every single one of those settlements with the exception of Har Homa. So Har Homa is a key sticking point, which you guys might be able to see. What else in East Jerusalem? So then we're what we call the Holy Basin. The Holy Basin, the core of the Holy Basin is the old city of Jerusalem, the famous old city. It's just 1 kilometer squared. It's built into 4 quarters, and it has there, the Wailing Wall, which is for Jews, and then it's got the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and so on and so forth. That's even a tiny, a few maybe 100 feet. It's very small when you get there. So we're talking about 1 kilometer squared, and it's littered with important holy sites. And so how do you divide that? And to divide the actual city itself is a little bit more simple because it is so segregated. The Jewish quarter can go to Israel, and then the Armenian, the Christian, and the Muslim quarter can go to the Palestinians, and then you have to figure out what to do with the Wailing Wall because both Muslims and Jews find very important religious significance to it. So that's the sticking point. And also the holiest of holies, which is below the Dome of the Rock, which also complicates things in terms of who controls sovereignty. But in terms of Jerusalem, it gets a little trickier because of what's called the Holy Basin that goes beyond the old city. So there's the old city, and if you see right around the old city, there's these additional key religious sites for each one. And to give you an example of one, you have, this is a population area, I'll get to this in a second. You have the city of David. So the city of David are these excavations that the Israelis are currently undertaking where they believe that they found the archaeological area where King David city used to live, or part of the city used to live. And it's right there. The problem is that it's in Silwan. So this is a massive Palestinian neighborhood, or city, and right in the middle of it, you have the city of David. So the question is, what do you do about areas like the city of David that are very important to Jews? What do you do with the Mountain of Olives, where you have these very ancient Jewish graves? So things like that become sticking points that move beyond the old city, which you can see, there from the Dome of the Rock. You can see that this is outside of the old city. So what do you do with those key areas? Okay. So, as some of the plans that I'll go over, some of them decide, okay, we divide the city. One area is going to be under Palestinian sovereignty, one area is going to be under Israeli sovereignty. Other proposals that have been made is to internationalize the city. This was or at least internationalize the holy sites. This was a proposal that was given in 2009. But then, how do you define that holy basin? Palestinians define it differently than Israelis. And so that has been one of those areas where the two sides cannot agree on. And Har Homa, as I mentioned, is a key sticking point in terms of East Jerusalem. Okay, the next core issue is security. And here I'm going to focus mainly on Israeli security concerns. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Or
Yeah.
do you want me to wait till
No, go ahead.
So on the first slide for borders, you said that the settlement population has doubled since the start of the peace process.
Yeah.
So what do you consider the start of the peace process to be?
1993.
Okay.
So
it's
from
awesome.
1993 to today, the settlement population has more than doubled.
Okay.
Okay. So security. You'll constantly hear, so Netanyahu will say, one of the reasons why Netanyahu would not agree to what Obama and Kerry were trying to set up as the basis for the negotiations is the basis of the negotiations was going to be that negotiations need to be based on the 1967 lines. And Netanyahu will always say the 1967 lines are indefensible. What he's talking about is strategic depth. And so what that means is that in many areas, you probably are going to have a tough time seeing, but there's areas of Israel within the 1967 borders where it's only 9 kilometers wide. You can literally, take a jog and in a few hours you'd be across it.
the proximity to airports and things of that nature. Now, traditionally, when Israelis used to talk about this notion of strategic depth, wars used to be fought very differently. You know, that people would be fearful that some Arab army with tanks would be coming in from Jordan, and then Israel wouldn't have much of a buffer to defend that. Today, a lot of critics point out, in an age of intercontinental ballistic missiles, strategic depth is not really that much of an issue anymore. But this is, nonetheless, is one of the arguments that they make. And so what Israel constantly goes back to, as I'll show in the negotiations, is, okay, so if our border is so skinny, then give us some control over this area right here, which is known as the Jordan Valley, which I talked about how this is some of the first area where Israelis created settlements here, what they call security settlements were in the Jordan Valley. And as I'll show in some of the negotiations, you know, Israel wants either to have their IDF soldiers on the border, or they want to be able to lease some of this land for, you know, decades, or other kinds of things. Another proposal is to have early warning stations. So early warning stations that could be around here, the West Bank, that could help Israel in that case. Obviously, you know, another problem is now with the airport is the issue of rockets.
Sure.
Yeah.
Early warning station, like manned outposts? Or-
Yeah.
Okay.
So, well, it depends. So, I mean, there's all kinds of, you know, as speakers before, now you have drones. But yeah, the idea is that you would have some kind of outposts, and they would be, that Israelis in some way would have access to it, if not complete direct access. But they wouldn't be on the ground per se, they would just have some kind of outpost there. So security, as I mentioned, Jordan Valley. So, you know, ideas are, can we lease it? Are there going to be Israeli troops? Palestinians don't want any kind of Israeli troops in their territory. Can they be NATO troops? Can they be international troops? Can they just be American troops? So early warning sites, as I mentioned, there's the Palestinian, the future Palestinian state needs to be demilitarized. What that means is that, you know, they can have weapons, machine guns, and so on and so forth, but heavy artillery, like anti-aircraft missiles and things like that, they wouldn't be able to have. And security cooperation between the two sides is obviously going to be key. And the two sides obviously agree to security cooperation. That's not an issue. The final point are Palestinian refugees. And so here, as I mentioned, so borders, the importance is the 1967 war. Refugees, it goes back to the 700,000 and 1 million Palestinian refugees were created. And so these refugees either left, as most refugees leave a war zone because they're afraid, and they leave, you know, for a temporary nature, and then they intend to go back. But also, several tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, were expelled forcibly from their homes, and others left for other reasons. Today, the Palestinian refugee population, you know, it's been many decades now, and it's ballooned. You know, they've had kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, so anywhere between 5 and 8 million. And here you can see just in the region where some of those are, but obviously there's also Palestinian refugees in the United States, in Chile, and Europe, and so on. So how do you deal with the issue? So the first thing is refugees in Gaza and the West Bank, which is, if you will, the plurality of refugees, they're going to stay there. They're going to stay in the future Palestinian state. Then you have a big chunk of refugees are in Jordan, and everybody pretty much agrees, you know, today, if you were a Palestinian refugee from the 1948 war, you have Jordanian citizenship. Even though you don't have full equality, there's certain sectors in the positions in the military that Palestinian and Jordanians can't have. You know, they're treated for the most part as equal. So nobody's really worrying about what are you going to do with Jordanians. Nobody's worrying about what are you going to do with the Palestinian Americans or the Palestinian Chileans or the Palestinian Spaniards. What people are really worrying about, you know, before 2012 were the 550,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. Now, because of the Syrian civil war, you can add another 400,000 Palestinians that probably need to find an alternative to where they are. And so the 550,000 Palestinians in Lebanon, have been there, and they really are very much an oppressed minority there because of the demographic issues in Lebanon, which I can go into if you want later on. But they're basically second-class citizens, to be kind to the Lebanese government. That's the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. So what are you going to do with those? And so one option is obviously you can resettle them in the future Palestinian state. Another option is you can have a return to Israel. Here the numbers would be significantly low. So in the last negotiations, Palestinians have agreed that it would be 100,000 or less. Israelis, the most they've been willing to accept is 5,000. I'll go into when that was. So there's a big gap there. And normally they would be under family reconciliation, reunification, things of that nature. Refugees that were alive back in 1948. Another, they can resettle in a third country. Canada has said, we'll accept some Palestinian refugees. Spain has said, we'll accept some Palestinian refugees. And then there's going to be some kind of monetary compensation. Israelis now also want to mention the plight of Jewish refugees from the Arab world from 1947 until the 1970s for different reasons in different countries. But they at least want some kind of verbal acknowledgement in the final agreement.
Two questions. One, the acknowledgement, is that from the future Palestinian state or the neighboring Arab countries?
Yeah, that's where it gets it's tricky. I don't think they've gone into a lot of detail in terms of the Jewish. I think it's more something that politicians mention it in public, but in actual negotiations, there hasn't been any evidence that they've actually discussed that issue in any detail because they're still stuck, if you will, on the Palestinian refugee issue. But it would be some kind of some mutual acknowledgement that Israel and Arab parties were both responsible for the creation of Palestinian refugees as well as the subsequent, exodus of Jews from the Arab world. Something like that they would have to come up. But and that's really been something that people have been mentioning in the last 4 years max. Let's say of the 20-year process. Any other second question?
No, I'll ask that later.
Okay, so the rise of the peace process then. As we talked about, first you had the Madrid conference when they actually, they were, Israelis and Palestinians were meeting, were having secret negotiations by themselves with the United States. One of the trends that you'll see, and one of the arguments that I make is that when the United States is not a mediator and the talks are in secret, it's where Israelis and Palestinians actually have the most success. When it's not a big sample size, but when the United States is involved in these negotiations, is usually when they get the least amount accomplished. Then you have the Oslo peace process. It starts in 1992. It's an interim process. And then I'll talk about, so the difference between interim approach, which the previous speakers were advocating to return to, and what are called final status peace negotiations, which I would argue is the only way that you can really solve this, and you can't really keep pushing it on. So the Oslo Accords, without going into too much detail, because I really want to focus on final status negotiations, the important thing for you to know is the first thing is you have letters of mutual recognition. Okay, so Palestinians, the Palestine Liberation Organization, recognized the state of Israel. They sent a letter to the prime minister at the time, recognizing the state of Israel. Okay. Now, what Israelis are saying is that we want you to recognize as the state of the Jewish people. So there's been an addition to that. Israelis, on the other hand, they did not recognize the state of Palestine. They only recognized that the Palestine Liberation Organization is the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. So there was, a difference there, obviously due to the disparity of power, but that's what they had to come up with. The other thing that's important to note is Oslo II, and this is important because this is what the West Bank and Gaza is the control that they're under on right now. So the Oslo Accords creates the Palestinian Authority, if you will, the Palestinian government, right? So the Palestine Liberation Organization is an umbrella organization that represents all Palestinians, not just in the Gaza and the West Bank, but also all the refugees and so on and so forth. They represent Palestinian interests. The Oslo Accords creates the PA, the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is like the US government for Palestinians. It has a parliament and so on and so forth, police. And so with the Oslo I and Oslo II Accords, they create the PA, and then they divide the West Bank and Gaza, but we'll focus on the West Bank right now. And they divide it into areas A, area B, and area C. Area C is, all of this area that you see outside here, so you'll see all the Jordan Valley. Israelis never want to give up the Jordan Valley. And so it's 60% of the West Bank. That includes all the settlements, it includes roads to the settlements, it includes all kinds of things like that. Area A and B, here areas A and B are combined, but areas A are where Palestinian has both full administrative control, so day-to-day governing actions, but also security control. So the police is there and the police do their functions. That's in the major Palestinian city centers. So from Ramallah, actually all of the major Palestinian centers, with the exception of Hebron, which is divided into H1 and H2, but I won't go into that. You'll see that yourself firsthand. And then the other area is Area B, where Palestinian has administrative control, so government control, but Israel has security control. This is about 22% of the land, and it's about 400 villages. So not the big city centers, but the villages. And so Israel still has full security control there. Now, in reality, in Area A, Israel has, can go in with their military forces, as they do often at night, at will. So, it doesn't really mean full or sole Palestinian control. But it's important to know, because this is this is one of the legacies of Oslo, is how all of these areas are separated. And as you can see, so if you have major Palestinian centers like Ramallah or Tulkarm, they're completely separated. And so that's where you get checkpoints. And if you're a Palestinian living in Ramallah, it's almost impossible to be able to make it to another major metropolitan center in Palestine, because it could take out. So you can't have a job there. You can't go to university somewhere else. You can, but it becomes extremely burdensome. It could take you, on a bad day, several hours to get from, somewhere where you could job there quite easily.
What was that no man's land?
No man's land goes back to the 1948 war. Israel doesn't consider it no man's land. They consider it part of their own Israeli territory. So in the 1948 war, when you have the armistice agreements between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan, Israel and Syria, Israel and Lebanon, there are certain no man's lands. But with the 1967 war, where Israeli forces, or let's say in this case, it would be Jordanian forces, couldn't be there. So nobody could build there or do anything. With the 1967 war, Israel just took over that area and has built in those areas, but the international community don't recognize that as Israeli territory, and Palestinians, during negotiations, they don't recognize that as Israeli territory. And it's actually important because when they do the one-to-one land swaps, Israelis argue that Palestine, let's say, is 100 kilometers squares. Palestinians argue that Palestine is 105 kilometers square. So,
5 kilometers.
huh? Yeah, so that could be the 5 kilometers. So different areas, that's the main one, but different areas. So even when they're doing one-to-one land swaps, they don't agree in the starting point in terms of what is the West Bank and Gaza. So problems with the interim process. Even though the previous speakers want to go back to kind of interim process, the big problem and some of the lessons that, and the reason why they really moved to a final status negotiations is because deadlines went and passed. So they would say in 1993 they'd make a deadline, in 5 years we're going to cover all of these issues, and then 5 years would come and they hadn't even discussed anything. And so that was, when that happens, then there's this massive distrust that was being built because deadlines came and passed. The public also started losing trust in this peace process. They thought it was just going to be this ongoing, type of different form of an occupation. Now you're going to be occupied by the PA, not just Israel. Then you also have the problem with spoilers. So in 1994, you have the Hebron massacre, where an Israeli settler goes into a mosque in Hebron and shoots down more than 24 Palestinians that were praying. As a result of that, then you get this huge wave of Hamas starts its suicide bombing campaigns inside of Israel. And so that is also creating a bunch of problems. So when you start doing this interim steps, little steps, you allow spoilers to hijack the process. And that's precisely what happened. So final status negotiations. You have the most famous one, but not the most useful one, in my opinion, as I'll mention, is the Camp David Accords. So the negotiations took place maybe 50 kilometers from here in Camp David in Maryland. Then you have the Clinton parameters. The Taba negotiations and the Omerta-Boss talks, I would argue, are the ones that were the most useful. In the Taba negotiations, the United States was not even present. In the Omerta-Boss talks, Condoleezza Rice was kind of present in some of the talks, but for the most part, they were just negotiations between Abbas and Omerta. They met more than 30 times by themselves, with their negotiators and so on and so forth. And then you have Netanyahu Abbas, 2010, and then again, 2010 they lasted 3 weeks, and then you had the 2013 and 2014 talks, which I'll go into. But the first are, Camp David. So at Camp David, one of the reasons why you finally got to final status negotiations. So final status negotiations is you're gonna negotiate about everything. So as opposed to the Oslo Accords where, okay, we're gonna start giving Palestinians more autonomy. First they can control parts of Gaza and Jericho. Now we're gonna expand that area A, and now they can control Ramallah. Now they can control this area. Now they can control parts of the Hebron. So it's interim baby steps. In this case, it's, okay, what is the sovereign Palestinian state going to look like? How are we going to solve borders, Jerusalem, security, and refugees? So let's get it over with. And the argument at the time in 1999, Ehud Olmert was the Israeli prime minister, and he said, similar to what Netanyahu is now arguing, he said that I cannot continue to give little things to Palestinians because the Israeli public is going to kill me. The only way that I can sell further peace agreements with Palestinians is if we just settle everything. Then I might have a chance to sell this whole deal, but I just can't continue to do, little things. In Omert's perspective, why Arafat is not keeping his end of the bargain while there's suicide bombings going on and so on and so forth. So for the Israeli public is, look, you're giving them more autonomy and we're not getting anything in return. So for Olmert, it was like, for Barak, Ehud Barak, it was, let's just get it over with. Palestinians at the beginning obviously didn't like to be dictated by the Israeli prime minister. Look, we're putting an end to the interim process, now we're focusing on final status negotiations, which was one of the reasons why the Camp David Accords, or the Camp David talks were so unproductive. But they got there, and eventually now it turns out that it's the Palestinians that really want constantly to have final status negotiations, and the Israelis that to some extent want to go back to interim steps. And so what are the proposals? Now, when I talk about these proposals from now on, whether it's Taba, Camp David, you have to, take these with a grain of salt. We don't have the documents yet, for the most part. We only have 2 documents when it comes to the Camp David Accords. And I'll mention which ones they are. Everything is based on memoirs. And the memoirs, one memoir completely contradicts another, and so on and so forth. So you have about 20 memoirs between American negotiators, Israeli negotiators, and Palestinian negotiators, and you kind of try to set something up. And so that's what I'm going to try to do. So first, according to Palestinians, the farthest Israeli proposal at Camp David was that Palestinians were going to have sovereignty, so 100% of the West Bank of Gaza, and in the West Bank they were going to have sovereignty over 81% of the West Bank. Israel was going to annex 9% of the West Bank, so these areas and these areas. And look at the Jordan Valley. Israel was going to get this lease over the Jordan Valley and these other areas around the border. And this is actually what Netanyahu still wants. And that's obviously a huge sticking point because that's some of the highest quality land in all of the West Bank. You can grow almost anything there, as opposed to other areas. So it's a sticking point. So that's, according to Palestinians, that's the final offer that they received. Now, Palestinians hate this because in part they call them Bantustans, pointing to apartheid South Africa. Because, what you get is this Palestinian state that's completely separate from one another. And what Palestinians constantly mention is, if we're going to have a future state, it needs to be contiguous, meaning that there's no, you don't need any bridges or any tunnels, it's gonna be contiguous, with the exception of Gaza, but at least in the West Bank, it needs to be contiguous, has a contiguous border. And second is that it's not territorially compromised from other things like, so for example, here's the Ariel block. Even if it was cut here, it cuts major Palestinian population centers like Ramallah with Tulkarm, and Kalkili is completely isolated as well. And I'll show you that in a second in more detail what that looks like. Now, according to Israelis, what they offered was, at Camp David, was not that Palestinians get only 81%, but that they get 88.5%. And they acknowledged that there was obviously some special status to the Jordan Valley, but that at the end of the day, that's Palestinian sovereign territory, so you should include it in this equation. No land swaps, that might be the battery. But anyway, let's keep it on. No land swaps, and no refugees coming into Israel. Now, through Clinton, President Clinton convinced Ehud Barak, the Israeli prime minister, to give another proposal. But then Barak, a few days later, said, no, I take that back. I don't want to give that proposal. But at least it was on the table for a little bit, and they suggested that the future Palestinian state would be in 91 to 93% of the West Bank, so a little bit more. They agreed to a minor division of East Jerusalem. So this was, for Israelis, this is the big historic compromise came in here. They were willing to divide East Jerusalem, which every Israeli politician up to this point said that that city is going to be undivided capital of Israel. So that was a big deal, but Palestinians would get no sovereignty over their holy sites. It would really be only these outer cities of East Jerusalem, not even the cities that are adjacent to the old city, like Salwan. The Palestinian offer was 97 to 98%, so they allowed Israel to annex about 3% of the West Bank, 2 to 3%. They wanted equal land swaps, which, on the other positions they said no on land swaps. And on refugees, they already offered, so by this point there were about 5 million Palestinian refugees. They said, look, only about 400 to 800,000, which is obviously a lot, but they argued that, look, if you're worried about this demographic influx into Israel, with 400 to 800,000, Israel will still be comfortably a Jewish majority by that point. Not anymore, but by that point. Then you get the Clinton parameters. So Camp David talks collapse, and Clinton is in his last weeks into his administration. He wants to be remembered for something beyond the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and so he comes up with the Clinton parameters. And this is what people are asking Obama to do now. That is, come up with a plan and tell Israelis and Palestinians either take it or that's it, right? So this is what he did. And now they were not actually given a map. This map was later printed by Dennis Ross. They were just given a piece of paper, and 1% of the West Bank is going to be from Palestinians. So Israelis are going to get to annex about 4 to 6% of the West Bank. And they argue that this is about 80% of all Israeli settlers would get to stay in Israel. So they would only have to evacuate about 20% of settlers. And they said land swaps, okay, 1 to 3. So not 1 to 1, but for every 3 kilometers that Israel gets to annex, Palestinians get 1 kilometer back. Obviously, Palestinians didn't like that at all. They thought that was very unfair. But the one legacy that is very positive of the Clinton parameters is Jerusalem. So here in the Clinton parameters, they came up with this formula that, one second. Yeah. They came up with this formula that Israeli neighborhoods were going to stay under Israel and Palestinian neighborhoods were going to stay in the Palestinian state. So basically an equal division of East Jerusalem. And that, everyone up until Netanyahu agreed with that formula. Minimum number of refugees. Now this is where it gets tricky. The only 2 documents that we now have that have been released is that Israelis accepted it, but they added a ton of reservations. Palestinians did not accept it, they did not decline it, but they also added a ton of reservations. And now the reservations are now available and you can read them. Basically, both of them didn't really accept the agreement because they added reservations that went beyond the parameters. Then we get to Taba. Taba is a little bit more useful. You don't have US negotiators anymore. they were actually getting to a lot of progress. Israel's position was that they were going to annex 8% of the territory. That they agreed on terms of the rhetoric for an agreement in terms of refugees and things like that, but they just ran out of time. In 2001, Ehud Barak, the Israeli Prime Minister, is defeated in the elections. Ariel Sharon comes in. Ariel Sharon comes in saying that we're not going to negotiate and so on and so forth. You have the start of the Second Intifada. And so the negotiators are basically, they're told, come back home. So they were making a lot of progress on their own in secret negotiations, but they just ran out of time. Would they have come to an agreement? Who knows? This is just an interesting slide. So this is at Taba. This on the left, you see the Palestinian proposal. On the right, you see the Israeli proposal. And this is something that's interesting. When we talk about percentages, what's important to understand is that percentages, it could be 5%, but for Palestinians that might be extremely intrusive. Or it could be 3%, and that actually is very good for Israel because with 3% you could annex 75% of all settlers. So it just depends on where that land is. And one of the big disagreements is, so for example, is when Israelis are giving their percentages, they don't just want, let's say so this is Ma'ale Adumim right here. So this is a settlement right outside of East Jerusalem. They don't just want, let's say the buildings for Ma'ale Adumim are only here, in this area. But they want what they call the whole settlement block. They add this thing for block, which means they want additional territory around it. Palestinians usually, so you'll see here's an example of how, some of the area, for Palestinians it's much shorter because they just add those homes and that's it. So when you hear settlement blocks, for Palestinians, that's no. You just get where the settlers are. You don't get this additional territory and so on and so forth. So this issue between blocks and not blocks is a bit contentious. It's important to note that in 2002 and again in 2007, you get what's called the Arab Peace Initiative, or the Saudi plan, sometimes it's referred to as. And this is that every single Arab country, and later on it's accepted by every Islamic majority country, is that they basically tell Israel is, look, you come to an agreement with the Palestinians based on the 1967 borders, and we will normalize all relations with you. We can have regular economic relations, we'll have embassies, we'll have diplomats, it'll be normal. The conflict will not just come to an end with Palestinians, but it'll come to an end with every single Arab country and Islamic country, including Iran and so on and so forth. Iran has signed on to this and so on. It's also important because they give quite a bit of movement to Palestinians. They don't call for a right of return of all Palestinians, as you constantly see here. They just they call for a just solution to the Palestinian refugee problem. Israelis don't like that all of this is consequent, that peace is a consequence of all this kind of stuff. They say, look, just sign a peace agreement with us now, and then we will give this to the Palestinians. So that's the best counter that Israelis can make to the Saudi peace agreement. In 2015, as I mentioned, Sharon said no to peace negotiations with Palestinians. In 2005, you have the disengagement plan of Gaza. So, and we are out of battery. So in 2005, you have the disengagement plan of Gaza. So Israel withdraws its forces from Gaza. It had about 10,000 settlers in Gaza, as well, in addition to a couple of military outposts there. So withdrawals, the problem is this was a completely unilateral move. So there was no negotiation with Palestinians, and obviously all of the demands of Palestinians weren't met. So for example, Palestinians are a little scornful about it because this is Israel yet again trying to dictate terms on Palestinians, as opposed to, say, meeting all of their demands. What about East Jerusalem? What about the West Bank? What about additional settlements that you're building in the West Bank, and so on and so forth? So it's this disengagement plan that is not negotiated with Palestinians because it causes a lot of problems. In addition, Hamas takes this as a victory, and they said, look, violence works. We've been fighting Israel, and we get our land back, right? And it kind of shunned Abbas at the time, who's begging Sharon for negotiations, showing that, that kind of the moderate way, if you will, to negotiate with Israel, cooperate with Israel kind of way doesn't work. And in addition, it also, it's not, there's also the argument, was it a full withdrawal, if you will, right? So Israel still controls, not just obviously the border, because it's their border, but they control the air, they control the sea, they control the water, they control the electricity that goes into it, they control all kinds of things, right? So is it a real withdrawal, or is it, or is it something else? And then other people argue that, one of the quotes that I had was from Ariel Sharon, shortly right after, when he was trying to sell the agreement to the Israeli Knesset. Ariel Sharon, and I'll paraphrase here because I don't have the exact quote, essentially said, look, we are being bombarded by things like the Arab Peace Initiative, which I just showed you in a second. If we don't do something, they're going to keep bombarding us with this as well. So a lot of analysts argue that this was a move for Sharon in order to be able to solidify control of the West Bank and take some international pressure off by withdrawing from Gaza. And the international pressure was building because of the Arab Peace Initiative and so on and so forth. So after 2005, you get the very important talks between Israeli Prime Minister, so Ariel Sharon has a heart attack, has a coma. Oh, yeah. So Ariel Sharon has a heart attack and goes into this coma, and Ehud Olmert comes into power. And Ehud Olmert, who was the former mayor of Jerusalem, comes up with some very interesting proposals on how to divide Jerusalem. And he starts having these negotiations with Abbas, and they've been the most successful negotiations that we've had on this issue. When it comes to security, both sides, both Olmert and Abbas agree that they basically agreed on all terms in terms of security. Demilitarized Palestinian state, we're going to have some early warning stations. Israel was not going to get to control the Jordan Valley, but there were going to be some kind of troops, either NATO troops or something like that. So on security, they agreed. They also, for the most part, surprisingly, agreed on East Jerusalem. They agreed on East Jerusalem, and here the idea was Israeli neighborhoods in East Jerusalem are going to go to Israel. Palestinian neighborhoods are going to go to the Palestinians. But the holy sites, this is what Olmert came up with, the holy sites, the old city, they're going to be internationalized. They're going to be under some kind of international supervision. And this was a big shock for a lot of people coming from the former mayor of Jerusalem, who throughout his whole political career had said, there's no way we're ever going to divide East Jerusalem. Now there is a disagreement here in terms of what they define as the holy basin. So Abbas, in his recollection of what they agreed on, says that it was just going to be an internationalized of the old city. Olmert claimed that it was also going to include some of that broader holy basin that I showed you earlier, like the city of David, like the Mount of Olives, and so on. So there's a bit of a disagreement there. In terms of refugees, Olmert actually agreed to a small number of refugees. He agreed to 5,000 refugees. Abbas brought the number down from 400 to 800,000 to 100,000. And their argument was, look, when Israel loses all of those Palestinians that live in East Jerusalem, which is over, close to 200,000, only accepting 100,000 actually is a net gain in terms of the demographics for Israel to stay Jewish majority. But still a big gap between 5,000 and 100,000. And then on borders, there were some key sticky issues. So the Palestinian map was that Israel gets to annex 1.9% of the land, of their settlement. So 1.9%, so of all of the West Bank, the Palestinians are going to keep 98.1% of the land. And they argued that, look, with 1%, allowing Israel to annex 1.9% of the land allows Israel to still be able to annex a majority of its settlers, between 55 and 60% of settlers. So they could sell it to their domestic population as saying, look, we are able to keep the majority of settlers there. From Olmert proposition on the maps, it was between, he wanted to annex between 6 and 7%. And so the biggest sticking points in terms of settlements are Ariel, the Ariel block, which is in the north. You always see this area that kind of sticks out. It's this southern Ariel block and then the northern Ariel block. And so we're not just Ariel, which you guys might visit, which is 33,000 Israelis, but the actual block itself. And that block isolates Tulkam in the north, Palestinian city with Ramallah. It also, the southern area also completely isolates Qalqilia. So the Palestinians, this is not a viable Palestinian state. In addition, Ariel also has a water aquifer that's very important that Palestinians don't want to give up, so there's that added kind of notion. So you have Ariel, Malay Adumim. Malay Adumim is a massive settlement right outside. Here's East Jerusalem, it's right outside right here. And Palestinians don't want Malay Adumim because it doesn't allow Palestinian cities to expand from East Jerusalem. So Palestinian cities would be contained basically where they are. There's a little bit of room in that area, that E1 area that Daniel was talking about earlier, but Malay Adumim is a big constraint to that. And then another area is Efrat. Efrat is probably less of a contentious issue because it's really a road that can probably be moved around. But Efrat was another issue. And Har Homa, as I mentioned, in East Jerusalem, although they said that they came close to an agreement there, probably allowing Israel to keep it. So those were the Olmert Abbas talks. But what happened? Why didn't they come to an agreement? Well, like the Taba talks in 2001, they ran out of time. In 2008, Olmert started being investigated for corruption charges, which a few weeks or months ago he was completely charged of. And so he was a sitting duck. Everybody knew it, that his time was running out. And so Abbas did not want to make an agreement with an Israeli leader that was losing whatever legitimacy he had left in Israel, and it was probably going to be gone in a matter of weeks, if not months. So they ran out of time yet again. So then comes Benjamin Netanyahu. And Netanyahu comes to power again for his second term. And you've had two talks. You've had talks in 2010 that lasted 3 weeks. And those talks, basically, they didn't talk about anything. And so the Netanyahu-Abbas talks are even more difficult than the ones of the past, because the ones in the past, to analyze them, at least we have all these different memoirs and so on, and so on. For the Netanyahu-Abbas talks, it's completely based on leaks to the press and some statements that some people have made. So we don't even have memoirs, right? So even take these even with a further grain of salt. But the 2010 talks that lasted for 3 weeks, basically, the Palestinians came up with a map, essentially the same map that they offered Olmert a few years before. Israel gets to annex 1.9% of the settlements. And Netanyahu's team said, we will not discuss maps. We will not discuss borders yet. We can discuss security, and once security issues are taken care of and are agreed upon, we can start discussing borders and Jerusalem and refugees and so on and so forth. So basically, since the Palestinians weren't getting anything in return, the talks collapsed. Then you get John Kerry, 2013 and 2014. In these talks, it seemed, Netanyahu was pressured a little bit more. And as far as we can tell on the leaks, these are just leaks, but he came, they proposed a map where the future Palestinian state would be on 90% of the West Bank. So less than what Olmert offered, less than what was offered at Taba in 2001, possibly even less than what was offered at Camp David. But a lot of people say, look, this is Netanyahu, who always said that he would never give up on the West Bank. At least he's saying that he only wants to annex 10% of the land. But there's a caveat to that. It's not really clear what his position on land swaps are. For the longest time, even 2 years ago, he was completely opposed to land swaps. So it was, we annex 10% of this land and that's it. You don't get anything in return for that. There are conflicting leaks as to whether he's changed his position on land swaps. Some people argue that he has. But he hasn't changed his position on the Jordan Valley. So we're talking about 90%, but he doesn't want to give up control of the Jordan Valley, that eastern part of the area. And so he says that he wants at a minimum a lease, some kind of long, decades-long lease where Israel still has control over it, which of course Palestinians would not accept. The Palestinians still, they have moved on, again, these are leaks, they have potentially moved from 98.1 to 97. So allowing Israel, instead of just annexing 1.9%, they now allow it to annex 3% of the land. So there's been a little bit of movement in terms of that, But as Makovsky mentioned, they couldn't even agree on the security issue, which is mainly that Jordan Valley type of component. And that's what it comes down to. And so they couldn't agree on that. They, Netanyahu didn't really want to discuss Jerusalem either. And on borders, you have, so we're talking about a 7% gap. And that's a huge gap, right? That's Ariel, that's Ma'ale Adumim, that's Efrat, that's Givat Ze'ev in the north of Jerusalem. Those are very big settlements that really go deep into Palestinian territory and make, according to Palestinians, a contiguous and viable state impossible. So that's where we are. Any questions? Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly how relevant this is, but this past May, Netanyahu said that he supported the general idea of the Arab Peace Initiative. I'm just wondering if you think that that is at all significant.
Not really. I mean, it's like supporting general ideas of a Palestinian state until you actually get into the details of it. Very simple. You can ask somebody is, look, are you willing to give up the Ariel block? If not, there's probably not going to be a peace agreement. So making these broader statements without, as Gaid Al-Amari mentioned, we know what the details are. We know what the gaps are, right? So the gaps to the borders are Ariel, Ma'ale Adumim, Har Homa. What is your position on that? If your position is we get to keep Ariel, which certainly that's Netanyahu's position, there's not really going to be a peace agreement. So, being open, it's the one thing I'll say, and I didn't mention this, the other thing that was very important about the Omert Abbas talks is that Omert, unlike Ariel Sharon, Omert really recognized the significance of the Arab Peace Initiative. And whenever they were negotiating anything, he made sure that they wrote down or that they agreed that this agreement meets the guidelines or is consistent with the Arab Peace Initiative. So whatever agreement they were going to accept on, it was going to say, and this is consistent with the Arab Peace Initiative, right? So he was very important in doing that. Netanyahu, maybe in that statement, at least is recognizing the importance of the Arab Peace Initiative, and that whatever statement, whatever agreement you come on, there will be some kind of acknowledgement that it's consistent with the Arab Peace Initiative. But you need to get into, the details. Yeah.
So you clearly advocate for final set of solutions over the incremental, like our previous speakers. So my question is, they were sort of critical, if not just hesitant, about the current leadership, and that's why they would prefer incremental versus final status. Do you think that it's just going to have to wait until new leadership comes in and they're more willing to work on a peace deal, or to just keep throwing things at the wall and see what sticks?
No, I think you need new leadership. Personally, I think that Netanyahu, throughout his whole career was basically opposition to the creation of a Palestinian state. Now he's been pressured to a point where, he needs to kind of at least show some kind of openness. But it's quite clear that maybe that him personally is not willing to make the necessary, sacrifices, if you will, because for him to come to an agreement, let's say evacuate Ariel, that that's his domestic political base. It's very difficult for him to do that. And complicating matters, so not just at a personal level, then the people that he constantly aligns with himself with in the coalition that coalition will not survive under a Netanyahu type administration. So I definitely think that you need new leadership on the Israeli side. I actually also think that you need new leadership now on the Palestinian side for different reasons than what Gaith was arguing. I think that at this point, Abbas probably doesn't have enough legitimacy amongst the Palestinian population. It's just, whether it's his uncommitment to democracy, whether it's further corruption, or whether it's just constantly doing this, what a lot of Palestinians see as, this peace process that doesn't give anything to Palestinians, and continuing to have, you'll hear this from Palestinians on the ground, that, Palestinians cooperation with Israelis, security cooperation. So a lot of Palestinians on the ground, they see this as basically now just being the enforcer of the Israeli occupation. So he's too old, he's out of touch, and I really think, you need to have a new leader in there. Perhaps, very controversially, but perhaps Marwan Barghouti, who's in jail, he would have, the support at least for a short time, or perhaps a leader that we don't know. But I think that in polls, it's quite clear even though he's more popular than he is than Hamas at the moment, he still doesn't have majority support from the Palestinian population. So I don't even think that he would be able to sell a deal to his own population. So, yeah.
When we talk about potential land swaps, we know that Israel will want, certain key pieces of land, settlements or strategic locations, etc. I don't know if I saw in any of the maps, potential areas of land that are currently like Israeli that would be given to Palestinians if the swap was to take place. Like, do we know?
Yeah, we do.
It's like,
Unfortunately, my computer died of the battery, but yeah, the slides that I had, I was going to show the land swaps.
Okay.
And just to give you, so there's a couple of important things about the land swaps. That there's been a lot of scholars that have done the details about the land swaps, and there's only so much land that's that Israel can give that's adjacent to the West Bank or adjacent to Gaza, right? Without bumping into an Israeli Jewish neighborhood or an Israeli Arab neighborhood. There's only so much land. And so in these studies, there's only about max 5.5% of land, for a land swap that they could do. So anytime an Israeli comes up with a proposal that say, we want to annex 7%, you can probably start scratching your head in terms of where are they going to find that 7% land. That's number one. Number two that further complicates that is that even in that 4.5% of land, that includes the southern part of the West Bank, or the northern, that little part in the bottom, is just complete desert. And in all of this land swap proposals, you'll see in the Palestinian proposal, they don't want that land. And Israel, always, that's the area where they give most land for the land swap, because it's a desert. Who's gonna give prime real estate really close to East Jerusalem for this desert where you can't grow anything, right now? So that's another issue in terms of land swaps, is the quality of the land is a big issue. Now, the interesting thing, though, and there's a scholar that's working on this right now, he hasn't come out with the study yet, but it should come out soon, is that the land swaps actually provide a bridge for the right of return. Because there are certain areas where Israel, that are adjacent, where Israel could give that land swap, where it was an actual former Palestinian home that was, where those people became refugees. So there are certain areas, I don't know the numbers, but at least a few thousand Palestinians will actually, with these land swaps, will actually get to return to their former homes. So there is that added, at least psychological component to that, if not real, on the ground practical.
What's that scholar's name?
I can't say because it's secret.
Oh.
He hasn't done it yet. Yeah.
And some of the land around Gaza is really important. That's the one that the Palestinian, Gaza needs more land, for that.
Because it's so densely populated.
Yeah,
But even there's only
it's
so much.
that
There's
can-
only so much that it can expand because it runs into Israeli.
Or like Egypt.
Sea, right, well, yeah.
But my question is, when did they change that the peace deals need to be ratified by both populations? Because that was not in the original. Now they have both parliaments voted, basically made it contingent on a public vote, or?
Yeah, this is recent. I mean, on the Palestinian side, the first time that this became an issue was with what's called the first attempt at, it's not the Mecca Agreement. The Mecca Agreement between Hamas and Fatah, or the rest of the PA. And this was in 2005 or 2006. And basically, it was the first of many failed reconciliation governments between Hamas and Fatah. And so in this Mecca agreements, basically what Hamas's position was fine, you guys, and I'm being Hamas, if you will, he's telling Abbas, go ahead, waste your time negotiating with Israel, it's not going to come to anything anyway. But in case you do, we'll accept it as long as you put it up for a national referendum, and if Palestinians voted in favor, we'll accept it. We will recognize the Palestinian elections and so on and so forth. So that's the first time that in the Palestinian, as far as I know, that in the Palestinian kind of discourse, this idea of a national referendum where it's not just the negotiators need to come up with an agreement, but you actually need to, Palestinians would have to vote on it, it would have to happen. And so, and now it's been, as you mentioned, it's been passed in the Knesset. And in the Knesset, it had a lot to do with coalition politics, with the coalition in Israel. So different, so Bennett, a more right-wing kind of coalition member of the Netanyahu coalition, you know, again, he made the same argument, go ahead and negotiate with the Palestinians, you're not gonna get anything anyway. They're all committed to the destruction of Israel, so go ahead and waste your time. But in case you do, let's make sure that there's a national referendum. So there's been different factions in Israel and in Palestinian that want this added, that are against a negotiated settlement in terms, you know, because they have a pretty good idea in terms of what it would look like as well. That they want to add, if you will, an added obstacle, or that want to give themselves a chance to be able to scuttle an agreement.
What do you think is more likely? Some kind of, you know, a compromise of the current state of negotiations on the two-state solution, or eventually maybe like a one-state solution where Israel slowly keeps building the settlements, you know, slowly expands? You know, what do you think is more likely in 50 years even?
Yeah, so I don't know 50 years, but let's say in 25 years. So one of the things that I disagree with when a lot of people argue that there's only, so the argument that a lot of people make to Israelis, let's say to Netanyahu, Americans, diplomats love to make, you know, Obama has made it, Joe Biden has made it, when they go to Israel and they say, look, Thomas Friedman loves to make it in the New York Times. Is look, if they tell Israelis, or they warn Israelis as if they don't know this, that look, if you can't have both a Jewish and democratic state, given demographics, in a matter, you know, if you want to keep all of the land, right, in a matter of years, literally, I mean, it might have already happened, but in a matter of 5 years, certainly, if you take all of the people from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, so Gaza, Israel, and the West Bank, there's going to be a majority of Palestinians. So if you maintain control of all of these, you're not going to have a Jewish majority, or you're not going to be democratic, because you're going to need to have some kind of apartheid system or some kind of second-class status in order to be able to maintain control of your institutions. I think that's a false dichotomy, that you can either have just a two-state solution or a let's say, a Jewish minority apartheid state. I think there's a ton of interim steps that you could take, and that's where I see things going. I don't see any negotiations happening anytime soon, in part because I don't think that whoever's going to replace Netanyahu is going to be any less hardline because of demographics within Israel. So just on elections, I'm pretty pessimistic about that. But what I could see is, say, someone like Bennett becoming prime minister and saying, okay, we're going to annex that 60% of the West Bank that we control, that we already control. Palestinians can have the remaining 40%. That's it. No demographic issue there. Palestinians are going to be in the West Bank, are going to be like they are in Gaza now. Who cares? We just control that 40%, that 60% of the West Bank. We have no demographic issue. That's one. Number two, who says that the occupation can continue as is right now? It's already worked for 40, you know, almost 45 years, or however many years we're going on. Why not another 40 years? So there's a lot of things where I really see that as a false dichotomy. And I see that if someone like Bennett is, or Lieberman is elected prime minister, I could see potentially some kind of attempt at, if not annexing all of that 60%, at least annexing all of the territory that's within the wall. So that's over 10, 11%, you know, things like that. So I can see a lot of other alternatives to